Today we're going to talk about responses to the Protestant Reformation. So first, we're going to look at how the Catholic Church responded to this challenge of both its political and its religious power. And then we're going to look at how the art world responded to the Reformation. And we're going to look at Mannerist and Baroque art. All right, so let's first talk about the Counter-Reformation, which was the Catholic Church's response to the Protestant Reformation. So this was an effort to revitalize the church and then respond to some of the Protestants' criticisms. So they realized they were hemorrhaging members, so they sat down and were like, well, how are we going to get these folks back? What can we do to sort of respond to some of those criticisms, but also market ourselves and improve ourselves so that more people want to be Catholic again? So the Counter-Reformation had three key components. First, there was the regeneration of religious orders, so groups of monks and nuns. There was the creation of the Jesuit order, which was one of these religious orders, but so important it gets its own bullet point. And then finally, there was the Council of Trent. All right, so let's talk about the regeneration of religious orders first. So again, as I mentioned, these are monks and nuns. So if you are living in a monastery, you are a member of a religious order. So during the Counter-Reformation, old religious orders were reformed and renewed, and then new ones were formed. And what these orders did is they really focused on sort of like the works side of salvation. So we know that the Catholics during this time believed that salvation comes from both faith and good works. So these orders really focused on good works in addition to faith. So these good works were they cared for the sick and the poor. They spread Catholicism, right? They played a really important role in marketing it and bringing people back to the church. And then they also improved the education of clergy, so members of the church, and lay people, so ordinary Catholics, right? And the reason why this is important is what they're doing here is they're directly responding to one of the criticisms of the Protestants, because the Protestants were really upset by the fact that they perceived that the priests in the Catholic Church were not especially well educated or knowledgeable about religion. So one of the things that these religious orders did is they taught their members and they taught ordinary people more about Catholicism. There was also a new emphasis on mysticism and personal experience of God. And again, this is also kind of their attempt to claim a part of what Protestantism was doing. Because we know Protestantism, right, was all about having that personal relationship with God through your own personal reading of Scripture. So the church didn't totally do away with the idea that the Pope was the head of religion and that his interpretation was what mattered. But they did say it was possible to have kind of like these personal spiritual experiences of God. And this statue here is a great example. So this is Saint Teresa. She was a nun. And this statue is a depiction of one of her experiences where she had like a dream about an angel piercing her heart with an arrow. So as you can see here, she's having a very personal, emotional experience of God here. All right, so the most important of these orders, as I mentioned, was an order called the Jesuits, or the Society of Jesus is another name. And this was founded by this guy named Ignatius Loyola, and his whole goal was what he called, or what some people have called, this idea of spiritual warfare. So he was really, really interested in spreading Catholicism. That was one of his main goals. So spreading it abroad, so Jesuit missionaries went to Asia, especially, and spread Catholicism there. And he was also really interested in restoring it in Europe, so taking back followers from the Protestants. So he played a really important role in restoring Catholicism in Poland, for example. So his other focus, in addition to sort of restoring Catholicism and bringing people back into the fold or spreading it around the world, was education. So again, we mentioned this was one of the things that those religious orders did. So the Jesuits are famous for establishing schools, again, for clergy, so to educate priests, but also to establish or to educate ordinary Catholics. So you may be familiar with Jesuit High School in Sacramento, and they are a direct sort of example of one of the Jesuit schools that the Jesuits established. Obviously not during the Reformation, much later, but they're still following in that tradition. All right, and then last but not least is the Council of Trent. So this was basically the Catholic Church got together and they had two really important goals here. The first was to sort of just affirm the beliefs that they thought were important. They looked at what the Protestants were saying. You're like, actually, you know what? You're wrong. Yeah, we believe this, and we're not going to get rid of it in response to your criticisms. But they also kind of accepted some of the criticisms of the Protestants, so they also reformed some of their practices. So again, there's affirmation here and there's reformation. So affirming the practices they liked, reforming the practices they didn't. But before they even got to that, really their first priority was to condemn Protestant reformers. So they just came in, they said, you know what, we do not like Martin Luther, we do not like Calvin, et cetera, et cetera. They are all going to hell. And sort of following from this, they published something called the Index of the Forbidden Books. This is actually a little bit earlier than the Council of Trent, but it was kind of similar in spirit. So they went and they banned a bunch of stuff they thought was sort of anathema or against the Catholic Church. Then once they had done that, they sort of affirmed what they believed and then reformed some of their practices. So that first of all, they affirmed that only the church, only the Pope could interpret scripture. So they rejected that idea that the Lutherans had, that you personally interpret scripture. They affirm that faith and works are necessary for salvation. They affirm the 7 sacraments, including transubstantiation. But then again, they made some changes too. So they put in plans to reform the training of priests. So what they did is they established seminaries, which are schools for priests. So again, responding to that Protestant criticism that priests were too uneducated. And they also reformed the sale of indulgences. So what that means is they basically said, so indulgences do work. You can buy your way out of purgatory, but they kind of slowed down on the really aggressive marketing of indulgences. So people were they're like, well, they work, but we're not going to push them as hard as we used to. All right. So now let's talk about some of the artistic responses. So the first movement that we're going to look at is Mannerism. So this started around the 1520s and it lasted through the early 1600s. And this actually kind of evolved out of the Renaissance. So it started in Italy, but it's a real emotional response to the anxiety and the uncertainty of the Reformation. So you might look at this picture over here on the right and say, well, that looks like Renaissance art, but there's some things that are a little bit different, right? So Mannerist art broke the Renaissance principles of balance and proportion. They also used asymmetrical composition, so again, kind of following from that. And oftentimes you'll see in Mannerist art really awkward, elongated bodies. And there's an emphasis on really intense emotion, often really intense negative emotion. So this image here is probably the most famous Mannerist painting of all time. It's called Madonna of the Long Neck. And while you don't necessarily see really intense negative emotion, you can really see that rejection of the Renaissance principles of balance and proportion. So all of the figures in this image are really shifted over to the left. And then you can see that really the Madonna here, so the Virgin Mary, has this kind of strange body shape. Her neck is really long. She's kind of bent in this strange way. Baby Jesus is really long and floppy. So again, you just see that sort of rejection of that perfect, those perfect balanced compositions that you would see in Renaissance artwork. All right, and then after Mannerism came Baroque. So the Baroque movement started in the early 1600s and lasted through about 1750, and it also started in Italy. And like Mannerism, it really emphasized emotion. And when I say emotion, it really emphasized drama and grandeur and power. So it's not really about uncertainty or anxiety in the same way that Mannerism is. Baroque is a lot more self-assured, and we'll find out why that is. And the reason why I made it all drama and grandeur and power in all caps, because Baroque art is it's a very all caps art form. And it has this real focus on these lush, realistic bodies. So if you see women who are super curvy, that's probably Baroque art. And sort of borrowing from Renaissance art, there's a real emphasis on that chiaroscuro technique. So again, there's a lot of contrast between light and dark. And they use that again to emphasize that drama. And Baroque art's interesting because it was actually connected to the Counter-Reformation. So again, there's this idea of power and strength in Baroque art. So what the Catholic Church did is they commissioned Baroque works to emphasize their power and their strength. So that statue I had under the slide on religious orders, the Bernini statue of St. Teresa, having that personal experience with God, that's a Baroque statue there, commissioned by the Catholic Church. And in addition to the Catholic Church, absolute monarchs also commissioned works for the same reason, to emphasize their power. But we haven't talked about absolute monarchs yet. We will talk about them next unit, so you don't need to worry about them too much right now. So again, this is also probably one of my favorite Baroque works here. This is actually painted by a woman, and this is Judith beheading Holofernes. I don't speak Greek. Painted in the early 1620s. And again, you can see there's this real emphasis on sort of drama and emotion here, right? Judith is really going at that guy, right? This is also a great example of chiaroscuro. You can see that a lot of the painting is really dark. The background is really dark, but there's this light source illuminating the figures. You can see how pale Judith looks here, right? But again, really that emphasis on power and strength in this case. So Judith's power and strength, which is super interesting. All right, that's it for today. Thank you so much for watching.